Who creates value? Who extracts value? And could it be that by not actually getting that distinction right, we also destroy value? This was a big conversation for many years, and it actually drove economic thinking. It drove economic thinking because the concept of value, so productive, unproductive labor, was actually at the heart of how economists kind of thought, taught, contested each other. And you shouldn't forget John Maynard Keynes' great quote, which was that practitioners on the ground who think they're just kind of doing good or bad stuff and think they don't need to worry about economic theory are actually slaves of defunct economic theory. So the degree to which and how we engage with this debate about productive, unproductive, value creation, value extractive, does actually guide policymakers. But when that becomes invisible, when we stop debating that, policymakers can also get extremely confused and more susceptible, more captured, more corrupted by particular ideas about who the value creators are. Unashamedly, after the crisis, Goldman Sachs CEO said, Goldman Sachs workers are the most productive in the world. What do we mean by the value that's actually produced by Goldman Sachs workers? Silicon Valley, wealth creators. So wealth creators to mean just business, and in particular, nowadays we use it to talk about, the innovative kind of high-tech businesses. That's a problem. As well as after Brexit, ring-fencing financial services because of the value that they create for the economy, high prices of drugs justified through concepts of value like value-based pricing. How can it be that the drugs for hepatitis C are costing hundreds of thousands of dollars or euros or pounds, and the justification always goes back to value? And then the opposite. So the state is not really a value creator. We don't have words for it. At best, it facilitates value creation. At best, it redistributes value. But basically, if you look at the history of thought from the mercantilists, the physiocrats, the classicals, they had different theories, but they did bring it back down to this issue of how to steer the economy in such a way that we make it more productive and perhaps nurture and reward those activities that we think are actually creating stuff. But they all had different takes on it. So the mercantilists, at a time in which there was a lot of trade and there was the emphasis on terms of trade, put the focus on exchange. And so they wanted to make sure that the exchange rates were right, the terms of exchange were right. The physiocrats, in a period in which most wealth was still created on agricultural lands, not surprisingly put value, so productive capital, in what farmers were doing in land. And classical economic theory, so Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Karl Marx, the classical economists who were writing during the Industrial Revolution, not surprisingly put labor and industrial labor at the heart of where they thought that sort of production boundary lied. Then something happened. Okay? We moved from an objective theory, where there were sort of concrete things that we could say perhaps were at the center of the value creation process, to a more subjective understanding. So preferences and kind of value in the eye of the beholder. But just believe me that today in neoclassical economics, which is taught all over the world, first of all, what's interesting is they don't even talk about value. There's one theory of value being taught, and we've sort of rid economics departments of this history of different theories of value. But also, by then not questioning it, it doesn't even have to be called value theory. In fact, the word itself has disappeared. It's basically Econ 101. And Adam Smith is actually quite interesting. He had what was basically a classical labor theory of value, but he made a very clear distinction between it, literally in terms of what people were doing, the category of work, whereas Marx, who came after him, was much more subtle. He said that, yes, labor is where value comes from, but it doesn't mean then that if you are in the financial sector, you're unproductive. He tied the concept of production and productive labor to whether surplus value was being created. And surplus value, as you know, was tied to his understanding of labor exploitation. So as long as the activity, he didn't look at sectors or categories of work, the activity of a particular financier or merchant was in fact allowing that surplus value to be realized, then he called them productive. But it wasn't a normative point. This wasn't productive is good, unproductive is bad. He was looking at what actually produces profits and the degree to which those profits are reinvested, allowing the capitalist accumulation process to happen. What to do? Well, first of all, let's admit that value is in fact created collectively, and that this concept of value in some ways has been hijacked by putting it just at the level of individual preferences. This has also really made it much easier for these narratives and storytelling about value to be used to capture policymakers' minds. We need to understand that both also in the policy process, it's not just fixing markets, but actively together co-shaping and co-creating them. And it also, coming back to Marx, he said it's not the category of work, so it's not that finance is bad in or out, it depends what it's doing. And so similarly, instead of bashing the hedge funds and the credit default swaps as simply extractive versus industry, really thinking of what are the serious revolutionary reforms we could be doing, not the tinkering on the edges, to steer finance back into the production boundary. Let's actually make it productive. It means definancializing the real economy. It means really linking prices to how they're produced, so the marginal price of most drugs is actually zero, but also linking it, perhaps delinking how we set prices from those costs actually, and thinking more about values around access. What kind of healthcare system do we actually want collectively, and actually then use the price system to achieve that value versus vice versa. It could affect how we govern knowledge and the whole IPR system, which is one of the most areas that have been hijacked and captured by these stories about value creation. And it could also actually help us steer the direction of growth through much more explicit ways to talk about this co-creation of markets through public purpose missions. Actually, we can change things because it comes down to organizations that can be governed in different ways and interact in different ways through this explicit recognition of the collective value creation process. And unless we fundamentally change the stories we're telling about value, it's going to be extremely hard to actually get a more progressive distribution of that value, because we're going to continue to have value extraction being done in the name of value creation.